You think you're tough? One day in ancient China would destroy you. No clean water, no mercy from the law, no escape from parasites, torture, or backbreaking labor. Your body would break, your rights wouldn't exist, and your name wouldn't matter. This wasn't a movie. It was survival. And you wouldn't last till sunset. Wake up in ancient China, and the first thing you'd feel isn't hunger. It's dread. Because breakfast, it wasn't something to enjoy. It was something to survive. If you were a farmer, and chances are you were, you'd start your day with a bowl of thin, tasteless porridge made from millet. Not the soft, comforting kind you know today. This was gritty, boiled-down mush that clung to your teeth and your ribs. It filled your stomach just enough to keep you from fainting in the fields. Forget meat, forget eggs. Maybe once a month, you'd get a sliver of pork or a bit of salted fish if your family hadn't already traded it for firewood. Vegetables, only what you could pickle, dry, or dig up. And most of them were so overcooked they tasted like bitter water. But here's the worst part. The food wasn't just bland. It was dangerous. Grain was stored in huts, open to rats, bugs, mold. You wouldn't know what was in your bowl until it was too late. Worms, rot, spores that could wreck your liver. Rice paddies teemed with parasites, and you were eating it all. No clean water either. Rivers doubled as sewers. Wells were shallow and full of runoff, so people drank hot broth or weak wine not to celebrate, but to avoid dysentery. Imagine starting your day sipping warm, cloudy water just to avoid dying before sundown. That was breakfast in ancient China. Not a meal, a gamble. One you lost more often than not. That was just breakfast. Now imagine what happens when nature calls and there's no toilet, no privacy, and nowhere safe to go. If you've just managed to choke down your breakfast, brace yourself. Because going to the toilet in ancient China wasn't a private matter. It was public humiliation wrapped in filth and disease. For the vast majority of people, there was no such thing as a bathroom. No door to close, no water to flush. Instead, people relieved themselves in open pits dug behind homes, shallow trenches in the village, or, if you were in a town or city, crude communal latrines built directly above cesspools teeming with human waste. These places were filthy, slippery, and swarming with flies. The stench was unbearable, so strong that some people fainted before they could even squat. And don't expect privacy. In many cases, you'd squat next to neighbors or strangers in full view of one another, with nothing but shame and eye contact to keep you company. But it didn't stop there. Human waste was actually valuable. It was collected as night soil and used as fertilizer for crops. Workers carried it in sloshing buckets through crowded streets, splashing it over roads, fields, and sometimes people. Hygiene? Forget it. No gloves, no protection, and no concept of contamination. Toilet paper didn't exist. The wealthy wiped with silk. The poor? Bamboo sticks, husks, leaves, or just their hands. Infection, parasites, and skin diseases were rampant, especially among children. This wasn't a one-time horror. This was daily life. And now, with your hands still unwashed and your stomach churning, it's time to face the backbreaking labor waiting for you in the fields. Now that you've eaten and survived the public nightmare that was a toilet, it's time to work. And in ancient China, work wasn't a task. It was a lifetime sentence. Over 80% of the population were peasants, and that meant working the land from the moment the sun rose until long after it set. There were no days off, no weekends, and certainly no retirement. Your life was measured in harvests, and your worth in sacks of grain. If you were a farmer, your day began before dawn. You'd head to the fields barefoot or in thin straw sandals, pulling a wooden plow hitched to an ox, if you were lucky enough to own one. Most tools were primitive. Hand-carved hoes, stone sickles, woven baskets, and water carried on a shoulder pole that dug into your spine. During planting or harvest seasons, 14 to 16-hour days were normal. Under the blistering summer sun, heat stroke, exhaustion, and dehydration were constant threats. Women worked equally hard cooking, weaving, hauling, planting, raising children, and often returning to the fields as laborers. And children didn't get childhoods, they got chores. And for all this backbreaking effort, you didn't own the land. It belonged to nobles or the emperor. Your reward? Grain quotas, taxes, and fear. Fall short, and you risk punishment, debt, or exile. You'd think the end of the workday meant rest. But in ancient China, even falling ill wasn't a break, it was another kind of torment entirely. And next, we'll see what medicine looked like when pain was just part of the prescription. After a full day of backbreaking labor, you finally collapse, aching from head to toe. But don't expect relief, because in ancient China, getting sick didn't earn you rest. It earned you more suffering. Medicine at the time was a mix of genuine wisdom and dangerous guesswork. Traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, was rooted in concepts like qi, yin, and yang, and the 5 elements. Some of it worked. Herbal remedies, acupuncture, and cupping had real benefits. But for the average person, access to trained healers was rare. You relied on local herb sellers, old folk remedies, or spiritual rituals that did more harm than good. Mercury and arsenic were used in treatments for everything from skin rashes to internal infections. Compounds we now know are deadly. Wounds were cleaned with wine or salt if they were cleaned at all. Infections festered. Broken bones healed crooked. Fevers were treated by burning mugwort over your skin or by consuming mixtures of dried lizard, bear bile, or ground-up horn. Anesthesia didn't exist. Surgery, if attempted, meant enduring the knife fully conscious. Toothaches? The tooth was yanked out by force, usually after days of agony. Bleeding was considered a way to balance the body's energy, so you might be cut intentionally just to restore harmony. If your condition didn't kill you, the cure often might. And for the poor, even these crude treatments were out of reach. But as brutal as medicine was, it couldn't compare to what happened if you ended up on the wrong side of the law. If you thought sickness was cruel in ancient China, try crossing the law, because once you were accused of a crime, real or imagined your life was no longer your own. The legal system, especially under dynasties like the Qin and later the Qing, was designed not for fairness, but for fear. Justice wasn't blind. It was brutal, hierarchical, and often arbitrary. For minor offenses like theft or tax evasion, you could be publicly flogged, have your head shaved, or be forced into hard labor far from home. Repeat offenders, or anyone who dared challenge someone of higher status, could lose a limb or their life. More than 200 crimes were punishable by death, including some that seem unthinkable today, like speaking ill of an ancestor or owning a forbidden book. Confessions weren't gathered with evidence, they were extracted through torture. Interrogators used bamboo rods, iron shackles, or finger-crushing devices. The idea was simple: confess, or we keep going. Once convicted, punishments were carried out publicly. Beheadings, hangings, even the infamous lynching, or death by 1,000 cuts, meant to prolong agony and terrify onlookers. And if you thought noble birth gave you protection, you were partly right. The wealthy could buy their way out with silver or favors, while the poor faced the harshest outcomes with no chance of appeal. Justice wasn't about truth. It was about obedience. And if somehow you escaped both sickness and sentencing, there was still one more enemy waiting: war, and the chaos it brought to every doorstep. If disease didn't take you, and the courts didn't crush you, then war would come knocking loudly, violently, and without warning. Ancient China was a land of breathtaking empires, but it was also a battlefield that never truly rested. Dynasties rose and fell through endless bloodshed. The Warring States period, the Mongol invasions, the rebellions of the Han, Tang, and Qing all left ordinary people caught in the middle, powerless to stop the storm. For peasants, war didn't mean glory or banners. It meant soldiers marching through your village, seizing grain, burning fields, conscripting your sons, and leaving you to starve. Armies lived off the land, which was a poetic way of saying they took whatever they wanted. Crops were stolen, homes destroyed, and families scattered in moments. If you were forced into the army, things didn't get better. Armor was minimal. maybe padded cloth or leather. You carried a crude spear or rusty blade. If you were wounded, there were no medics, no bandages, no battlefield mercy. Infection killed more soldiers than arrows ever did. And sieges, they were hell. Cities starved behind walls. The defenders ate rats, then pets, then each other. Disease thrived in the crowded, filthy conditions. Surrender wasn't always an option. Entire towns were slaughtered to set an example. The trauma didn't end when the war did. Ruined villages, shattered families, famine and lawlessness remained long after the armies moved on. And yet, through all of this, daily life still demanded its toll, because even in peacetime, you weren't safe from suffering. Even if you managed to avoid disease, dodge the courts, and survive the horrors of war, being a woman in ancient China meant your fate was sealed from birth. While men bore the burden of labor and law, women faced something far more inescapable: a lifetime of obedience, control, and silence. From childhood, girls were taught the 3 obediences: obey your father before marriage, your husband after marriage, and your son once widowed. Their lives revolved around the home, but not in comfort. Domestic work was relentless: cooking, weaving, hauling water, raising children, and still working the fields when needed. They were expected to be invisible and indispensable at the same time. In wealthier families, the suffering took a different form. Starting as young as 5, girls underwent the brutal practice of foot binding. Their feet were broken, bent under, and bound tightly for years to create the so-called lotus foot, a status symbol that guaranteed a life of pain, disability, and dependence. Walking became torture. Running, impossible. Marriage was arranged, love was irrelevant, and once married, a woman was expected to serve her in-laws as dutifully as her husband. Widows were discouraged from remarrying. Some were even praised for committing suicide after their husbands died, seen as an act of loyalty and virtue. Education was rare, independence was non-existent, and abuse was often ignored or justified. And even if a woman accepted her place, she still had to live in a world where superstition, fear, and unseen forces shaped every choice she made. Superstition controlled every corner of life. Even if you followed every rule, worked yourself to the bone, and accepted your role without question, your life in ancient China still wasn't entirely your own. That's because nearly every decision, from where you built your house to when you harvested your crops, was filtered through a lens of superstition, ritual, and cosmic fear. People didn't just live in the physical world, they lived under the weight of ancestral spirits, celestial signs, and invisible forces believed to control everything from illness to luck. A solar eclipse wasn't just a natural event, it was a divine warning. A poorly timed sneeze, a sign that your journey should be delayed, or worse, cancelled altogether. The placement of your home, the layout of your furniture, and even the direction you slept in were dictated by the rules of feng shui. If you got sick, it wasn't germs, it was a curse, or a spiritual imbalance, or punishment from your ancestors. And every year, during the Ghost Festival, people burned paper money and food offerings just to keep the spirits from turning hostile. Important decisions, marriage, childbirth, travel, were scheduled only after consulting fortune tellers or spirit mediums. A single bad omen could derail your entire future. This constant fear wasn't just cultural, it was survival. Angering the wrong spirit or misreading the stars could bring shame, disaster, or death. But as much as people feared the unseen, it was the everyday realities, the filth, the disease, the hunger that left the deepest scars. And nothing embodied that more than the daily fight to stay clean. If superstition haunted your thoughts, then poor hygiene haunted your body. In ancient China, staying clean wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible. For most people, washing wasn't part of a daily routine. It was something you did a few times a year, maybe during a festival, or in the spring when water wasn't frozen and you could afford to stop working long enough to scrub yourself. Soap, as we know it, didn't exist for commoners. Wealthy households might use plant ash or animal fat mixtures, but for peasants, cleaning meant rinsing in muddy rivers or wiping down with damp cloths. that hadn't been washed themselves. Clothes were rarely changed and almost never properly laundered. Most people owned 2 outfits at most, one for work, one for burial. Lice, fleas, and skin infections were part of daily life. Children often developed boils and rashes that never truly healed. Toothbrushes were twigs, and dental hygiene was non-existent. Rotten teeth, bad breath, and constant toothaches were common even among the young. The streets didn't help. Urban alleys were filled with animal waste, rotting food, and night soil sloshing underfoot. In the summer heat, the stench became unbearable, clinging to your clothes, hair, and skin no matter how far you walked. And yet, despite all this, you were expected to endure, to show up for work, for ritual, for survival. Because in ancient China, even exhaustion wasn't an excuse. And for the final cruelty, you wouldn't even understand the language around you. By now, your body's aching, your clothes are filthy, and your dignity's long gone. But there's one more problem. No one around you would understand a single word you're saying, and you wouldn't understand them either. The spoken language of ancient China wasn't anything like modern Mandarin. In fact, depending on the dynasty and region, you'd be surrounded by dialects so different they might as well be separate languages. From Wu in the east, to Min in the south, to Jin in the north, each had its own tones, vocabulary, and pronunciation. Even if you've studied modern Chinese, you'd still be completely lost. As for writing, Classical Chinese, or Wenyan Wen, was the written standard for over 2,000 years. It was poetic, compact, and extremely difficult to understand without years of scholarly training. Only the elite could read or write it fluently. Over 90% of the population was illiterate, relying on word of mouth, signs, or symbols to navigate life. You wouldn't be able to buy food, ask for help, or explain where you came from. To the locals, you'd sound like a babbling madman, mispronounce the wrong word or use the wrong tone, and you might accidentally insult a nobleman, or worse, utter something considered blasphemous. Without language, you'd be voiceless, powerless, and dangerously vulnerable. But even if you somehow learned the words, survived the work, and avoided the worst, you'd still have to face the crushing reality of your place in society. And that place, it never changed. You've eaten rotten food, squatted over a pit, worked till collapse, feared the law, survived war, and still there's no escape. In ancient China, pain wasn't a possibility, it was a guarantee. No rights, no rest, no way out. You wouldn't last 24 hours, so the next time your coffee's cold or your Wi-Fi's slow, remember, you're living in paradise compared to the past. If you stayed till the end of this brutal trip through history, hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and tell us, what ancient era would you never want to visit?